Ja, goedemorgen collega's. Ik stel voor dat we onze werkzaamheden aanvatten. Zoals u weet hebben wij de vragen om uitleg die voor vandaag geagendeerd waren op de agenda van deze commissie hebben wij verplaatst naar volgende week. Dus die vragen zullen volgende week aan bod komen. En gaan wij onmiddellijk over naar de hoorzitting die we hadden gepland. De hoorzitting over de aanbevelingen van de OESO voor het Vlaamse huisvestingsbeleid. Dat is er gekomen naar aanleiding van een vraag van collega Vijs, naar aanleiding van een werkbezoek van minister Diependale aan Parijs, aan de OESO, waar er een interessante gedachtenwisseling is gebeurd. En op basis van de vraag van collega Vijs zijn daar ook antwoorden gekomen. En het was dan collega Smeijers die de suggestie had gedaan om vertegenwoordigers van de OESO uit te nodigen in onze commissie. Er is ook simultaan vertaling voorzien, collega's. Voor de Nederlandse vertaling is het kanaal 1 en voor de Engelse vertaling voor onze twee gasten is het kanaal 2. Collega's, ik stel voor dat ik eerst het woord geef aan de vertegenwoordigers van de OESO voor een uiteenzetting. Ze hebben daarvoor ook een PowerPoint-presentatie. Ze hebben daarvoor gezorgd. En we dienen eerst nog een verslaggever aan te duiden voor deze hoorzitting. Collega Vijs, verslaggever. Dan geef ik het woord aan de vertegenwoordigers van de OESO, aan meneer De Mello en de heer Corneide. Aan jullie het woord.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks for the invitation to be here today. Thanks to you all for joining us at this moment. We are very pleased to have the opportunity to exchange views with you, to learn from your experience in this area, and hopefully the experience here of the OECD countries that we'll share with you can be useful to inform your own deliberations about housing policies. It was indeed very interesting for us to have the visit of the Flemish delegation to the OECD, where we could spend a day talking about housing policies and then to be able to revert back to you on some of these issues. What I have in front of you is just a very short presentation. I will not cover all the material there, but we are very pleased to leave the whole set of slides with you if you want to keep it. But we thought it would be useful at least to have a few of the slides with some of the comparative numbers, if you want, that can situate where you are relative to other parts of the OECD. I propose, if that's okay with you, I'll probably speak for some 15 minutes or so, and then Boris and I can come back to your to interact with you. Boris and I are in the economics department of the OECD. We are very involved in a project that covers a number of areas of the organization on housing policies. And the motivation for this joint venture at the OECD is the importance that governments are placing on housing policies. You are not alone in the world in facing this challenge of housing costs that are increasing and having to deal as a result with questions related to affordability, to how housing markets work, and other challenges that hopefully we'll have some time to talk about. So I just wanted to start off by showing a few numbers for the OECD area, just to set the scene, if you allow me. Let me try to work, and other challenges that it seems to be stuck. So I just wanted to start off. Thanks. Thank you very much. So you will see that this is a chart with several OECD countries, and Belgium there is marked in red. I'll come back to the situation within Belgium, but most of the information that you will see here will refer to Belgium as a whole, rather than the Flemish region in particular. But you'll see that over the last 15 years or so, many countries in the OECD experienced very rapid increases in house prices and rents. You see the triangle there refers to rents, and then you see that Belgium is in the situation that is comparable to countries like Denmark, like the United States, like the Netherlands, in terms of the rate of increasing prices and rents over this 15-year period. House prices have tended to increase much more rapidly than rents across the OECD area over this period of time. What is interesting as well to bear in mind is that the situation didn't stop with the pandemic. In fact, in many parts of the world, house prices actually picked up during the pandemic, have continued to rise, and hopefully we'll come back to some of these issues as well, some of the drivers of this increase in house prices and rents. Here is to zoom in on Belgium, and you will see that Flanders has, the green line, has followed more or less the same profile as Brussels capital, but both regions with a much sharper increase in prices than Wallonia, for example. What is the immediate consequence of that? Is the issue of affordability. Here is an indicator that we like to highlight. How much does it cost to buy a house of 100 square meters across countries, in terms of average household income? And then you'll see that in the case of Belgium, which is more or less in the middle situation of OECD countries, it now costs over 10 years of household income to buy a typical home of this magnitude. This is considerably more than what it did 2,000 years ago. So 2,000 years ago, you were in the neighborhood of 6-7 years. Now you are upwards of 10 years. So a big change in terms of affordability conditions over a relatively short period of time. Another important dimension of affordability is housing as a share of consumption. Housing items in general are a very important, very high share of household consumption baskets. You can see that Belgium is in a situation that is comparable to other OECD countries, with a sharp increase as well relative to 20 years ago. So the affordability issue is not one about the purchasing power needed to buy a house, but also how much do you need to allocate in terms of your budgets on housing-related expenditures as well. This affects essentially low-income social groups. You can see the numbers, the arrow for Belgium, if you want, there in the middle, where poorer households tend to spend a lot more on rents than they do on mortgages. So that also draws attention to the specific needs of the rental market as opposed to the buyer's market in the majority of OECD countries. Belgium is actually, comparatively speaking, among the countries with the highest shares of households, low-income households that are burdened by housing costs. Essentially, what this number shows is that what is the percentage of poorer households that spend at least 40% of their disposable income on housing-related issues. So particularly important affordability consideration for the low income. Housing costs also affect living conditions. It's not only the amount of money that you spend on it, but also the quality of living. And then you see that many OECD countries, this is not so much the case of Belgium, are affected by considerable overcrowding. So homes where you have a large share, percentage of people, or to put it differently, a concentration of overcrowded homes in income distribution. So this is the broad context, just to give you an idea of what's happening in other parts of the OECD, to give you a sense of the situation around the world. Now, it's more, I would like to spend a few minutes basically giving you the highlights of what our work is showing in terms of the main drivers of this increase in house prices over the years. One key aspect that we've been looking at is, are housing markets sufficiently responsive to changes in prices? Are you in a situation where if house prices increase, do builders react by expanding the supply of housing? And what we are saying is that the situation is very different across countries. There are countries where the supply responsiveness is very high. Take, for instance, the United States or Sweden to the right of this chart. There, if prices increase by a certain amount, supply expands more than what we economists tend to say, more than elastically, meaning there is more than a one-to-one relationship between changes in prices and expansion of supply. This is not the case of Belgium, for example. If you look at the far left of the chart, Belgium is among the countries with a relatively low elasticity, meaning that there are obstacles to the increase in supply. And when supply doesn't follow demand, then obviously prices rise. So what we see is that in countries with a relatively irresponsive supply, those countries are the ones where prices tend to, or have increased the most over the last 2 decades or so. So to us, that's an indication that looking at the supply side of the equation, if you want, would be an interesting way to analyze the case of Belgium. And again, we have done it for Belgium as a whole. I'm sure there are regional differences within the country, and we would like to learn from you about what you think those regional differences might be. So why is it that we have this situation? Let me start by looking at a number of drivers that are typical drivers of supply and demand for housing around the world. We see on the demand side essentially demographics. Countries where the population growth rate is very high are countries where there is a growing need for housing, and where prices tend to rise the fastest if supply doesn't follow that expansion of needs. This doesn't seem to be the case of Belgium. By comparison with other OECD countries, the demographics of Belgium is not very different from other comparable countries. Household income is another variable that explains increases in the demand for housing in many parts of the OECD. As countries become more affluent, people want better houses, they want more space, so they tend to demand housing. In both demographics and income growth, Belgium is not very different from other high-income countries of the OECD area. In many cases also there are issues that are related to policy. One of them is if the tax system, for example, creates an incentive towards home ownership. And then here I wanted to show the situation of Belgium just to illustrate where you are relative to other OECD countries. If you look on the left, for example, Belgium has relies heavily on the taxation of property. This is the case of most OECD countries anyway. Reliance on recurrent taxes on immovable property is a very important source of revenue, especially for regional and local governments, so you are not far from other OECD countries. What is more characteristic of Belgium in this context is that you have other taxes on, for instance, transactions, the sales and acquisition of real estate that are comparatively high relative to other OECD countries. You also levy wealth and inheritance taxes, for example, on real estate, and that you know, takes the overall tax take on housing at a level that is comparable to other high tax countries in the OECD area. One feature of the tax code that we find in many countries that creates an incentive for home ownership is also the deductibility of interest payments on mortgages. You see that many of the countries on the right here of the chart on the right have these very large gray areas there. Those gray bars, you know, essentially try to account for the predominance or the importance of that type of interest relief in the overall tax rate on real estate. These numbers refer to 2016, so they do not incorporate the most recent changes in the tax code in Belgium. We understand that you have reformed this aspect of the tax relief that you have, but it gives you an idea of what's happening in other parts of the world. And what it does essentially is, the more tax advantages you give to the acquisition of homes, the more home buying you're going to have, the less you will have, for instance, of availability of houses for the rental market, the less you would have probably for other types of tenure that may affect overall prices as well. Belgium has a very high home ownership rate in general. Flanders even more by the numbers that we have. So it's essentially, you are in a society of homeowners. So in places where home ownership is very high, there are other challenges associated, for instance, with the development of rental markets that become important. So this is for the tax take. Let me take you a bit to the supply side, if you want. And then there are various aspects of regulations that, according to our analysis, also affects the supply of housing. Let me take you to the ones, at least, where there is particularly important for the development of rental markets, if you want. And that's essentially how you regulate landlord-tenant relations, if you have rental control or other features of regulation that could create a disincentive for homeowners to put a secondary home on the market for rent. So typically what we see is that in countries that there is, where the regulations favor the tenant as opposed to the landlord, for example, you tend to have less supply of homes in the rental market. What's important here, to be clear, is not if you privilege the renter, the landlord or the tenant. It's not that, but it's how you reach a balance between the two so that you protect the renters, which is a legitimate objective, and at the same time you do not create disincentives for the development of rental markets. You see where Belgium is relative to other countries. You have a landlord-tenant regulatory setting that tends to favor the tenant as opposed to the landlord by comparison with other OECD countries, and that's the chart on the right there that shows you where you are. Another point, and I'm probably taking longer, Chair, I apologize for that, than I intended, is the issue about social housing. You see that social housing is a very important mechanism in many OECD countries to deal with the affordability situation, basically by privileging, by supporting lower income segments of the population, by basically making housing available on a subsidized basis for those targeted social groups. What we see in the case of Belgium, that is located more to the left of the chart, you have essentially, by comparison, a relatively low share of the distribution of tenure associated with social housing. If you take, for instance, your neighbors to the north, the Netherlands is one country where there is one of the highest shares of social housing among OECD countries. It's also the case of Austria, the case of Denmark, for example. So an area for policy that countries could consider, and ones that we often recommend, is some more investment in the whole social housing stock. We can come back to this point later on in the debate. I just wanted to highlight, to conclude, one aspect of housing policies that is becoming more and more prominent in our discussions with other OECD countries. There is the sustainability aspect. You know, how can housing contribute to the energy transition in our economies? A number that is important to bear in mind is that if you look worldwide at the share of housing in emissions, it's about 1/5 of total emissions is accounted for by buildings. So it's important in countries that are putting emphasis on decarbonization not to forget the housing sector as an important contributor to those efforts. And there are very specific challenges about decarbonizing the housing stock. We just wanted to show you where Belgium is on the map. This chart essentially shows the carbon intensity of the housing sector, how much carbon is needed in housing, versus the energy intensity of the housing sector as well. And you see that Belgium is in the middle of the chart, but by comparison with most other OECD countries, the housing sector is relatively energy intensive in Belgium and relatively carbon intensive as well. So this points to areas where, if you are interested in designing policies to decarbonize housing as a way of supporting broader energy transitions, it's important to look at the specific challenges of that sector. And I hope this gives you an overview of some of the aspects that, by our experience, countries are focusing on. I hope that it gave you some idea of the policy areas where there is a scope for action to support performance. And we are, needless to say, at your disposal if you want more information about policies and settings in other OECD countries, and look forward to interacting with you. Thank you very much for your patience, and I hope this has been useful to your debate.
Dank u wel. Ik stel voor dat we nu overgaan naar de collega's die aan het woord kunnen komen. Collega's, voor reflecties, vragen. Wie vraagt het woord? Collega Vijs, nu het woord.
Dank u voor het woord, voorzitter. I will try to ask my questions in English to make it a bit easier for you. Thank you very much for coming all the way from Paris. The OECD, we say OESO, of course, is an important organization, especially for policy analysis. So it's always valuable to have an exchange of ideas on that aspect. I'll go straight to the questions. I'm not going to make a grand analysis on the Flemish housing policy. I do that every week here. But I would like to focus on the studies that we got a short explanation about. First question regarding the private rental market. In the report, it says it is better to stabilize the rise of rent better than to impose a total freeze of rental prices, as has been done in Berlin, for example. We agree to that with Vooruit, but that is why we have a proposal to develop a rent break that would allow landlords to raise their rental price with a new contract, but only as high as the rental market value of the house, which is calculated by a tool that already exists in Flanders. It's called the Huurschatter. It's a policy tool that is actually designed to advise people who rent out a house on what a decent rent level would be, but it is not mandatory, but the tool is there. If the landlord wants to raise the price higher than the market value, he would have to make his case before a local rental commission, as exists in Germany, for example, which is composed of an equal amount of representatives from tenant organization as from landlords. So it's a paritary it's a parity commission. This rent break still gives landlords, in our vision, of course, a good return, which they already calculate today with the tool before they invest. But it would stop the excessive rents that go far above the market value. If they feel like the house would be worth more, they can always ask for a higher price, but it has to be objectified in front of the rental commission. How do you feel about this proposal as OECD economists? What would you suggest as a proposal to stabilize the rise of rents for new contracts? Do you have examples from other OECD member countries? And then the last question on that, because I thought it was very interesting to reflect upon the decarbonization of the housing and the housing market. How do you feel about the French system, which has been put in place since August, where landlords cannot raise their rent, not even with a new contract, as long as their houses have a low energy score, F or G? It's of course the French system scores. In that case, as long as they do not renovate, the price cannot be increased. I do think it is important to make the difference between a crisis measure and a long-term policy measure, of course. So what are the dangers macroeconomically of policies like that? How do you evaluate policies, these kinds of policies? Second question, as you mentioned in the report, there is indeed a growing divide between the lower income group and the higher income group in their access to the housing markets. The first group has increased trouble in buying a first house, while the higher income group increasingly has the possibility to invest in other homes than their own. Indeed, you already referred to the housing bonus, the woonbonus, who has been eradicated in Flanders, but on the Belgium level, we still have a tax deduction to buy a second, a third, or a fourth house. How do you evaluate that policy measure? What is your view on stopping that growing divide between owners and renters, low and high income? How would we be able to do that? And then a very important question, what is your view on the financialization of housing? We notice in many international research, unfortunately we don't have lots of data on the Flemish and the Belgian level on that. What is your view on that topic? Is it a danger? Should we prevent investors from taking over the housing markets, more specific to take over the rental markets, because the big difference is there that they do not simply invest, but also they are also the landlords in that case. If so, what would your recommendations be on that? With the current government in Flanders, the building of social housing has gone to a record low. There is a big budget, but for example, last year, this government was not able to spend 1 billion of the foreseen means. As you mentioned in the report, this is a trend also in multiple countries. What is the main reason for governments to stop public investments, and what are the consequences for the housing markets? Fourth question, you mentioned the policy bias towards home ownership. What would be other examples of a policy bias to promote renting more, or to go towards that balance that you referred to between ownership and renting? Fifth question, a bit more, I would like to have a bit more insight on the elasticity. You discussed the drivers of the supply and the demand, but what is the reason for that elasticity? Can you tell us more about that? Could you elaborate, please? Then, when we discussed the visit to OECD of Minister Diependale, one of the answers the minister gave us is that social and affordable housing initiatives are very difficult to compare between countries. Is this correct? How do you guys compare it? Do you agree with this hypothesis? And then lastly, a more general question. Being macroeconomists, you have a personal conception of the free market and how it works, of course, or an academic conception. How do you evaluate the way the market works within housing? Does it work in a way does it deliver affordable housing? It's a broad question, so I would like to know your insights on this all over the OECD for all member states, but also specific for Belgium and Flanders, if possible. Thank you for your answers.
Dank u wel. Collega Dazeleer.
Ja, dank u wel, voorzitter. Mijn Engels is niet zo goed als dat van meneer Vijs, dus als u me toestaat zal ik de vragen in het Nederlands stellen. Nu, ik had een vraag. In Vlaanderen zijn de registratierechten voor de aankoop van een bouwgrond verhoogd met 2%. Nu, mijn vraag is wat het effect daarvan is op het aanbod en op de mogelijkheid van een grote bevolkingsgroep om al dan niet over te gaan tot de aankoop. U zegt ook dat inderdaad België een laag aandeel sociale woningen heeft ten opzichte van het totale woonpatrimonium. Enerzijds is er in Vlaanderen nu een maatregel die zegt dat er maximum 15% sociale huisvesting mag gecreëerd worden door middel van subsidies in de Vlaamse gemeenten. Dus mijn vraag is dan ook, ja, wat zijn de perverse effecten hiervan? En hebt u goede voorbeelden uit andere landen van de OESO waar er een betere mix is tussen de klassieke woningen en het sociale patrimonium? En wat zou volgens u het ideale percentage zijn, sociale woningen, in een land zodanig dat je een ideale mix hebt? Ik weet ook wel dat je landen niet echt met elkaar kunt vergelijken, maar in Vlaanderen is het aandeel, als we dat bijvoorbeeld vergelijken met Nederland, toch wel heel laag. Ja, de prijzen van de huizen zijn in Vlaanderen ook minder snel gestegen. En ja, is het de mening van de OESO dat dit dankzij het ingrijpen van het beleid is, of zijn er andere invloeden en factoren die daarmee verantwoordelijk voor zijn? Dan had ik ook nog een vraag op het effect van de bevolkingsdichtheid op de creatie van het algemeen woonpatrimonium in het algemeen en meer bepaald sociale woningen. In België, en zeker Vlaanderen, is nogal een heel dicht bevolkt land, dus de marges om aan de aanbodzijde spectaculaire winsten te boeken is toch wel heel beperkt. En wat zijn volgens u de mogelijkheden om ondanks die hoge bevolkingsdichtheid toch aan aanbodzijde een sterke input te creëren? Dank u wel.
Collega Schouwvliegen.
Ja, dank u wel, voorzitter. Ik wil mij eerst en vooral verontschuldigen dat ik later heb aangesloten. Ik was met de trein, maar er was in Gent een probleem met het seinhuis. Dus daarmee dat ik hier te laat ben. Mijn excuses daarvoor. Ik heb hier ondertussen al eens snel door de presentatie gebladerd en ik had graag 2 vragen gesteld. Eerst en vooral de grote uitdaging betaalbaar wonen en sociale huisvesting. Wij hebben in Vlaanderen een recordbudget voorzien deze legislatuur om nieuwe sociale woningen te bouwen. Maar we zien dat het heel moeilijk is om dat snel gerealiseerd te krijgen. We zien ook dat we het niet zo goed doen als je de cijfers internationaal bekijkt. Wat zijn onze 2 grote struikelblokken? Dat zijn vaak de procedures, NIMBY-syndroom. Ik heb het hier ook in de tekst zien staan, dat men ook voldoende ruimte moet hebben om dat te kunnen creëren, de procedures die moeilijk lopen. Maar aan de andere kant zien we ook wel dat er heel veel in handen zit van de lokale besturen en dat daar ook wel een remmende factor zit. En er is hier al verwezen naar het feit dat elke gemeente of stad in Vlaanderen een binnensociaal objectief heeft. De ene haalt dat, de andere niet. Ik had graag geweten of u daar nog concrete suggesties heeft van hoe men dat in het buitenland beter en vlotter aanpakt. Dat was het eerste luik van mijn vraag. Het tweede luik heeft te maken met alles wat de schaarse open ruimte betreft. Dus wij moeten onze huizen duurzamer maken. We moeten ook op beter bereikbare plaatsen wonen. We moeten ook meer aanbod hebben, omdat de bevolking groeit en omdat het ook betaalbaar moet zijn. Aan de andere kant weet iedereen dat wij de schaarse open ruimte die er nu nog is in Vlaanderen, dat we die te volle moeten beschermen. Dat we niet alles kunnen volbouwen, dus dat we daar moeten mee stoppen. Er zijn ook plannen in die richting binnen de Vlaamse regering, maar dat botst wel. Het aanbod van beschikbare terreinen is bijzonder moeilijk, dus men zal heel veel aan inbreiding moeten doen, aan renovatie, aan bijna het creëren van nieuwe wijken in bestaande wijken die denser zijn. Daar is mijn vraag, zijn daar goede voorbeelden van hoe dat vanuit de overheid nog beter kan gestuurd worden en om dat ook op een betaalbare en eigenlijk een snelle manier te gaan doen. Dank u wel.
Dank u wel, collega Schouwvliegen. Dan geef ik opnieuw het woord aan de vertegenwoordigers van de OESO.
Thank you very much for a rich set of questions. Maybe I will start from questions that were made towards the end because they touch on a critical point that is common to essentially all the issues, concerns that were raised, which is indeed this question of availability of land and ease of building and the permitting process, because that's really the common thread through all the issues that are on the table here. So on these, indeed, there is a tension between the objective of allowing more construction, which is central for both the social inclusion objectives through social housing on the one hand, and the more general objective of affordable quality houses for everybody. So that is one objective, and the other one, which is to avoid using up too much non-artificial land. So the work we have done across countries shows that there are many places, and my understanding is that this applies to a number of Flemish municipalities as well, is that in many places land use regulations have minimum lot size requirements or a maximum that are ceilings that are imposed on the built area that can be set up for each footage of land. In other words, a lot of existing regulations force a low density form of development. Very often it is difficult to densify areas that are close to city centers, and the more easy solution from a land use regulation permitting perspective is to build smaller apartment buildings or semi-detached or detached houses in the outskirts of cities. And this creates issues for the environment in terms of absorbing land, also complicating the establishment of transport networks. So here, a critical avenue for progress is to facilitate densification by allowing higher density construction in areas that are reasonably close to the city centers where the demand is. And this indeed then raises the question of the not in my backyard opposition. There, what the experience of OECD countries showed is that the organization of land use is an important factor in the sense of who has the authority in the end to give the planning permission. If this authority is given at a very local level, if it is very highly decentralized, if it is made at the level of a district or a small municipality, then it creates conditions where the owners of existing land can block the development of neighboring land as a way of protecting the value that this scarcity creates for their land. And this results in blocked systems and therefore then cities that spread into areas where there is nobody to object to the development, and this is inefficient from an urban point of view, inefficient for the environment as well. What works better is when decisions are made more at what we call the metropolitan level, the level of the whole city, the level at which work and commuting takes place, so that the people who make the planning decision takes into account the entirety of the local job market, of the local housing market. On social housing, it is part proper permitting process is important for social housing as well. There were a number of questions on the size of social housing. Indeed, what the experience of OECD countries shows is that when social housing markets, when the stock of social housing is very small, as is the case in Belgium, it is difficult to achieve its objectives because then, if it is very small, it has to be very targeted. It creates lock-in effects where people have trouble moving out of the social sector. It is also an obstacle to regional mobility, so it works better when there is a higher share of social social housing, and also when there is an intermediate sector with rents that are higher than in social housing per se, but with an element of support through, for instance, provision by dedicated housing associations. Here, what we have in mind is what is occurring in Austria, for instance, where they have a model of limited profit companies that have special terms for investing, that reinvest all their profits that they make on their rental units in the maintenance of the stock and the extension of the stock. Then the question is that these systems tend to be inherited from a long history, as is the case in Austria or Denmark, for instance. Can this be set up? There are experiments that are going on. There are indications of progress in a country such as Slovakia, for instance, which a couple of decades ago set up a scheme that is in the inspiration of what the Austrians are operating. The OECD is currently advising Latvia to put in place this kind of system of revolving fund where the limited profits made on affordable housing are reinvested to expand the provision of social housing. On the rental market and the management of rent increases, I mean, this is a very fine balance to have an appropriate protection of renters who are in units on the one hand and preserving incentives to invest for landlords on the other hand. But what is more simple than this very complicated balance is that the one thing that will keep a lid on rents is competition and supply in the market. So to the extent that the permitting process, land use regulation systems will allow the construction of apartments for rent, this will facilitate this conversation enormously because it will put the pressure from competition in the market. And this is where also the tax system comes into play so that it is neutral between renting and owning, that it does not create very strong incentives towards owning rather than renting, because these incentives then generate a narrow rental market, and the more narrow the rental market is, then the more complicated all these conversations about rent increases become, and the more complicated the question of financialization becomes as well. Anyway, if the market is open with possibilities for densification construction, then the fact that capital is flowing into the market is good news. It facilitates expansion of supply, actually, and throughout the spectrum of housing. On the other hand, if supply is really fixed, then and capital comes into the market, what it does is move up land prices and makes housing affordability more complicated for everyone. So in the end, there are a lot of these issues that come back to the question of supply. where also, given the scarcity, another dimension that often can be explored is, in addition to allowing greater densification in already housing designated areas, make sure that the land use system also makes it possible to transform areas that were designated for other uses, commercial, industrial, into housing. There are countries, jurisdictions where this kind of single-use land use systems were actually very problematic obstacles to the adaptation of cities to housing demand.
Thanks. If I may, thanks again for these very, very interesting questions. I think you touched on the key issues that we are hearing in our exchanges with policymakers. I think Boris covered a lot of ground. Let me just make a few points that hopefully can address these questions. On the issue of the social housing, the difficulties in getting construction flowing a bit more. I mean, Boris obviously mentioned the issue of densification, of changes in land use regulations as important elements of that. So removing obstacles to the expansion of supply without necessarily leading to further sprawl. I think it's an objective that we hear in many of our counterparts, that they don't want green fields to be converted into housing estates. This is a social choice preference, and I think that's one that has to be taken into account. The issue is that once you decide how much you want, to prevent further sprawl, what can you do then to densify? One aspect, in addition to the ones that Boris mentioned, is the actual repurposing of existing buildings. There are many cities or countries that are promoting that as an option to basically increase the supply of housing without necessarily expanding, building more. For instance, in Portugal, just to give an example, there is a program that consists of assessing the scope for converting publicly owned buildings, even government buildings, public utility buildings, into housing. In some cases, especially in countries where there is a stock of this type of building that can be repurposed, there is some possibility there. Repurposing commercial buildings. I mean, we see with the phenomenon of working from home, with the pandemic, we are seeing cities that are essentially noticing lower demand for office space, for instance, for commercial real estate. And they're working towards changing regulations that would favor the repurposing of those properties. The reality is very different in different parts of the world, in different cities, but assessing the scope for that could be an interesting way of at least mapping where you are in terms of the potential for that type of policy. It will obviously require changing regulations, zoning one of them, but that will need to be considered. The point that we wanted to make here essentially is that to the extent that you can remove the policy obstacles to that, you would be contributing to increasing supply. The issue of rental markets, I go back to the point about the rent control, because that's again one aspect that we are seeing all over the world, different policies being put in place with varying degrees of restrictness, if you want. I think what is important here is to deal with two objectives at the same time, and there may be a trade-off there. One is to allow visibility on the part of landlords and tenants. Tenants need to know what the rule of the game, if you want to put it in a casual terms, what the rules are regarding rent. I mean, you don't rent a property not knowing how much the price will be 1, 2, 3 years down the line. So some regulation as to the norms regarding the adjustment of rents is perfectly legitimate. What we find undesirable is when there is outright bans on increases in rent, adjustments of rent, because you may be in the short term addressing an affordability problem. In the long term, you are going to be essentially discouraging the development of rental markets, or in some cases, which happens very often, you're going to be discouraging investment in the upkeep of buildings. So we see parts of the world where rent control is very tight, that the maintenance of building tends to be lacking. So there is a trade-off there to deal with. And that's particularly important if you place decarbonization high on your agenda, because there are costs associated with bringing old buildings, existing buildings, up to the standards and norms that are consistent with improved energy efficiency. So one objective there is to make sure that you can create room for financing that. So this trade-off between previsibility, visibility on how rents will evolve and rigidity at the same time, it's an important one to navigate if you want. I think what I heard about landlords and tenants coming together, this is a positive point, because after all, if you want a balance between the rights of tenants and landlords, having mechanisms of a conversation between them is an important step. The issue about reference or benchmark prices for rents, I think that's also, we see that this is an important element in this. Transparent information about rents in different parts of granular information about rents in different parts of cities. That helps a lot the market, because people have a reference point when they negotiate contracts. So that's also a positive element that I heard today. Let me go to the point about financialization, because that's again a topic that many people around the world are concerned about. I think here the key point is that the financial market is changing, the financing of housing is changing. It used to be essentially based on banks extending credits and mortgages. Nowadays there are other mechanisms, real estate investment funds, for instance, that are becoming more prominent in markets around the world. So the point is that part of the objective of expanding supply has to do with financing that supply, especially when traditional mechanisms are not sufficient. So having more diversity in the sources of funding for financial institutions, in the actors participating in the housing market, this is not per se a bad development. The issue is again how you regulate that, so that it doesn't become a risk to financial stability in general, that it doesn't become a risk to the liquidity of markets as well. So there is that element that needs to be taken into account. Let me focus on the issue of decarbonization, because this is an important one. There are two basic issues about the decarbonizing housing. One is that there is a split incentive between landlords and tenants. Landlords have no incentive to invest in improving the energy efficiency of their property unless they can pass on that cost to renters in the form of higher rents, or to potential buyers in the form of higher prices, right? So this is a reality in this market. So how can you deal with that split incentive? There are countries that essentially, as the case of France that was mentioned, that tie the rules of adjustment of rents to investment in decarbonizing or increasing the energy efficiency of homes. That is one way of doing this. Another way is subsidizing tenants or landlords directly to do so. There are different, let's say, mixes of policies there. What is very important in this case is that you have transparent, comparable, high-quality information on the energy performance of buildings. And what we see is that France is a country, and the Netherlands, another country just close to you, where it is compulsory to have an assessment of the energy efficiency of buildings, increasingly not only for new buildings that are new property that is put on the market. For new buildings, it's another story, right? Basically, you have building codes and norms that deal with new buildings. The problem is the existing stock. And in the existing stock, one of the deficiencies of energy certification was that it only applied to properties that were sold or put on the market for rent. So we are talking about small shares of the housing stock in many countries. So efforts to make energy certification, energy labeling more widespread, more comparable, would have a double advantage. One is that you can then create the necessary incentives for investment because essentially owners will see that there is a value attached to their investment. Tenants will see that there is a value attachment to the property they are renting. But also from the point of view of financing as well, because if banks can assess the credit worthiness of residents in buildings that have higher energy efficiency, they will say, well, higher energy efficiency, lower spending on energy, better credit worthiness, lower costs of financing. So there could be, a link about the cost of financing, the cost of investment in energy efficiency improvement, for instance, and the actual information becoming available about the energy performance of buildings. So there are several very positive, likely outcomes of efforts in this area, but more work is needed, to basically make sure that labeling, energy efficiency labeling, is widely used. The Commission, for instance, is making efforts in the new directive making efforts in that direction. So I'm saying all this because we consider that as a very important element towards, making sure that the incentives are aligned for investment towards decarbonization. I apologize, I don't want to go on and on, so there are other questions maybe we can come back to or address bilaterally so that we don't preempt any further discussion. I'm saying all this because we consider that...
Dank u wel, collega's. Zijn er nog bijkomende vragen of tussenkomsten in herhaling van de antwoorden en de inzichten die we gekregen hebben van de vertegenwoordigers van de OESO? Collega Vijs.
Yes, thank you for the answer. It was very insightful. I would like to pose two extra questions. The first of it is something that was mentioned in the study or in the report as well, where there's a low social housing stock. If I'm not mistaken, there was a recommendation to put in place policy to convince renters who have, let's say, promoted socially, social-economically, to move towards other meanings of housing. This is a debate that we have very often here, because of course my fraction often has the feeling that we have a very low social housing stock, which makes it so that often we have to choose between people with a low income and people with a very low income. So there's definitely a trade-off there. We often criticize measures that try to convince existing social renters who have improved socioeconomically to move out, let's say. But there's always a risk of stigmatization. It is often put forward in a way of that you have to earn social housing, you have to earn an intervention of the government. Do you have examples from other countries where they have a good system that promotes this? And then second of all, the elasticity, the non-elasticity, the very low elasticity of the Belgian housing market. Are there explanations for that? How can we improve that? And then last of all, on the rent control issue, in my first question I referred to the trade-off between a structural measure and a crisis measure, because of course we have a very, very high inflation, which has a huge impact on the indexation of rents today in Flanders. I referred to the French example. Also in Scotland, in Spain, there are also limits on the indexation right now. For how long of a period can you allow them without them having a structural impact? Because of course there's the acute and the structural. Could you elaborate, give us your opinion on that, please? Thank you.
Wel, zijn er nog collega's die wensen tussen te komen of bijkomende vragen hebben voor de vertegenwoordigers van de OESO? Zo niet, dan geef ik opnieuw het woord aan jullie.
limits on the indexation right now. For how long of a period can you allow them without them having a structural impact? Because of course there's
Thank you very much. These are excellent and also very difficult questions on the one of what to do when the social housing stock is small and how to deal with this issue that you want it to be very targeted, but at the same time you don't want people to be locked in social housing. I mean, as long as the stock is very small, there is no good solution to that problem. There is really a trade-off between the two. If you want really this small stock to serve its intended beneficiaries, you need a lot of targeting and regular reassessment. But this is a problem because it can create poverty traps. It is also an obstacle to mobility. This is why expanding the social housing and also making sure that there is affordable rental is important. On this, I wanted to emphasize a point that has been to repeat a point that Louise just made, which is that in the rental market there is really, something simple that can be done, and that applies to nearly all countries in Europe, which is to really provide much more transparency. When we look at how the information we have on the housing market, across the OECD now, almost everywhere, we have fairly good information about house prices, very good information about transactions. There are many countries that give you, through their statistical offices, sometimes through other providers, very detailed information about the value at which homes are changing hands. But it is very seldom that the same information is available for rents. So in this respect, this is politically much more straightforward to advance than the more difficult issues like rent control, zoning regulations, and it would already facilitate progress on the rental market, especially if it were combined with information about the energy efficiency of houses. On the low elasticity that you mentioned, it is really a question of supply that is at play here, that explains it, in the sense that it is complicated to develop. So what are the typical obstacles to supply adjustment? It can be very long permitting times, very uncertain procedures, if there can be, for instance, long appeals after permits are given, or simply the zoning regulations themselves, if they don't allow new development or force it to happen in the outskirts of the cities. And this is at the same time central and very difficult to reform. And what is important here is that the sooner changes are made, the easier they are. Because when governments wait, the more housing demand builds, the more land prices go up, and therefore the more costly then the changes become for the owners of land. In other words, the opposition by the owners of scarce land, this opposition, this reluctance to changes will build over time. So there is really a premium for acting sooner rather than later in this market. Then on the adjustment of rent control in the face of inflation, where there it's really an area of trade-off between dealing with short-term difficulties on the one hand, and then preserving incentives in the long term for the provision of rentals. So it comes, it boils down in the end to the adjustment as to how temporary the inflation shock is. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Just to refer to a couple of points. I mean, Boris covered a lot of ground on the issue about targeting social housing or targeting benefits related to housing. There is obviously, if you have a low stock of social housing, you have to ration it somehow. So targeting is a way of doing that. But more broadly than that, it is legitimate to have targeting because you don't want to extend public subsidies to social groups that do not need those subsidies, because that would be basically displacing scarce public resources that could be used in other areas. So you need to reach an ideal or a desirable level of targeting there that meets both equity and efficiency considerations. What we are seeing that is interesting in different parts of the world, you mentioned stigmatization. It is true that in many areas, the issue of urban segregation linked to a dominance of social housing estates, where there is a dominance of low-income social groups in those areas. That's a feature that city managers are finding more and more undesirable. So there are mechanisms to make it, the availability of social housing, less segregated. Options, for instance, that have to do in some places with permits for new developments that require a certain share of units in those developments to be of a subsidized nature. The other one is to essentially to spread the concentration of subsidized units across the city, promote some of those developments in more affluent parts of cities so that you eliminate this link between being entitled to a social housing, being a resident of social housing, and at the same time being stigmatized. Boris mentioned a very important element that is that we find very relevant in the design of those systems, which is the portability of rights. Why? Because you don't want people to be trapped in specific social housing in specific parts of the country. A dynamic economy requires also people to move. And when you have a very strong link between low residential mobility and low labor market mobility, that's a situation that you could avoid. And what we see in many places is that social housing, because it is scarce, because it is difficult to get, and because the rights are not transferable, that when you get it, you stay there for life. And then basically you don't move it, even if you have better job prospects elsewhere. So that's a situation where you want to break the link between residential mobility and labor market mobility. So that's one important, I think, increasingly important aspect of the design of social housing policies. The issue of rent control crisis and structural measures, because it's crucial and it's very topical, given what's happening in most of our countries. One key, I think, longer-term objective when you design those short-term measures is to avoid that, a mismatch between rental markets and other segments of housing markets, because that's what will discourage investment in the longer term, discourage supply, discourage construction, discourage people's interest in participating in the rental market segment. How can you do that? Well, mechanisms that smooth that increased cost as a result of short-term developments could be considered from that point of view. So it's basically, it's not, you freeze the rents because you are facing a specific crisis situation, and then that is translated into further rental increases over time. No, if you smooth that by basically having mechanisms whereby rents are adjusted on the basis of a moving average of previous increases, could be a mechanism where in the long term you don't lock in those mismatches, and in the short term you allow renters to have more, to make those increases, those short-term shocks more affordable. Thank you.
Dank u wel voor deze bijkomende toelichtingen. Collega's, zijn er nog vragen of tussenkomsten? Dan kan ik enkel de vertegenwoordigers van de OESO bedanken om hier aanwezig te zijn op onze hoorzitting en hun inzichten en visie en aanbevelingen met ons te delen. Ik had het bij de introductie al gezegd, was naar aanleiding van een vraag van collega Vijs en het bezoek van de minister aan de OESO in Parijs, dat de hoorzitting werd gevraagd. Ik ben ervan overtuigd dat het ons tot bijkomende of nieuwe inzichten heeft gebracht, die ongetwijfeld opnieuw zullen leiden in onze commissie tot boeiende discussies. Dus collega's, en het was inderdaad collega Meijers die het voorstel had gedaan om deze hoorzitting te organiseren. Vertegenwoordigers van de OESO, de heer De Mello en Corneide, bedankt voor jullie aanwezigheid. Bedankt voor dit allemaal met ons willen te delen. We gaan nog eventjes verder, heel kort verder met de agenda in besloten zitting, maar bij deze kunnen we de openbare zitting voor gesloten houden. Dan gaan we nu over naar de besloten zitting.